So it's a great pleasure, and I'm here in Liaoning province to interview Professor James Lee of the Institute of Technology in California. Institute of, how do you describe it, James?
The California Institute of Technology.
We can only use 3 words and I can get them all mixed up. Anyway, about his career and distinguished contributions to Chinese demography and historical studies. So, James, can you tell me something first about your family?
My family history goes back 4 generations, well, 5 generations. But one thing I was always very aware of growing up was that on some level the family history during that 5 generations sort of reflected a lot of Chinese history. And so the earliest generation we can remember is from about the 1870s. And that was my great-great-grandfather. And what we know about him is that he himself was born in Nanhuixian, which is outside of Shanghai, that he migrated to Shanghai, that he married into a family and changed his name to Li. It was a Yuxor local marriage. He was known later on as Li the button maker, so he probably was an apprentice who married the master's daughter. And that in the 1870s that he converted to the Episcopalian, the American Southern Episcopalian Church. And then at the time after the Taiping Rebellion, in the 1860s or 70s, took his 2 sons and his wife and their families to Suzhou to found an Episcopalian mission in Suzhou. And that his 2 sons, one of them who was my great-grandfather, became the deacon of the mission and of the school which they founded, which was called the Buffington Institute. And the other one was the dean of the school. And the school later on expanded and became Suzhou University. And the original church they founded is still there. It's directly if you're facing the school gate, it's directly to the left of the school gate. And that my great-grandfather, the deacon, was then in I believe it was something like 1912 or 1913, was awarded an honor degree of divinity from Randolph Mason University for his contributions to the mission, and especially for expanding the mission and his work taking the mission from Suzhou to Liaoning, specifically to Shenyang. And we only know about it because it's in the Episcopalian Randolph Mason archives. There's no information about that here that I found so far, either in Suzhou or in Liaoning. His son, who became my grandfather, was actually, I believe, so far as I know, either an atheist or an agnostic, and was a Shanghai businessman. But he had, for my grandmother, he had 5 children, and the eldest one was my eldest uncle, and who, since he inherited my grandfather's business, he became a worker with a label after 1949, and it's a worker with a label of being a capitalist, and so he had sort of a hard time of it, and he's now retired and lives in an old people's home in Shanghai. My second uncle, actually his name is Robert Lee, went to Cornell and got a PhD in agronomy, and later on became the equivalent of the Minister of Agriculture in Taiwan. And then later on became Vice President of Chinese Academy of Sinica in Taiwan, and President of Zhongxing University. and then now is taking a job at Texas A&M and retired and left Taiwan because of the Taiwan political situation. And then the third son was my dad, T.D. Lee, who went on to was the 1957 Nobel laureate in physics, and migrated to the States in 1946, and stayed in the States ever since. My fourth uncle I've never met my fourth uncle. What I know about him is that in the 1960s, he was arrested for embezzling and was sent to prison for 15 or 20 years. And that now he's a rehabilitated prisoner and raises pigs in Hunan, not far from the prison farm. And then my fifth uncle works at the other sort of CIT. He's a professor at Chalmers Institute of Technology in Sweden, and is professor of naval engineering. And so between sort of their histories with this sort of vast contrast, I always had this sense that you could sort of write a kind of history of modern China through the family, and that would show a certain sort of slice of a very distinctive slice of Chinese history. Right.
Thanks. What about your mother?
My mother's family is from Wuxi. I actually saw their genealogy about 9 years ago, and it was interesting because it said that they were originally from Gansu province in northwest China, and that there was an illustrious ancestor who in the 16th century who became an official in Wuxi, which is in Jiangsu province, in a very nice area. And then after he retired, he remained at Wuxi. And so she herself was born and raised in Shanghai and went to a Catholic missionary school and got a missionary fellowship to go to the United States to go to college. And that's where she met my father.
And moving on to yourself, can you tell us anything about your childhood that you remember?
Well, I think as an academic, for an academic biography, I think the only thing which is distinctive is that coming from an academic family, the question was never whether you'd become a professor. It was always a question of what field. And I went to boarding school in Lausanne for many years. And so when I was 14, I narrowed it to 3 fields, to economics, urban planning, or history. And so I went to see 3 professors at Columbia and got long reading lists and took all these sort of weighty tomes with me to my boarding school, and then decided, I guess at 16, that I wanted to do history. And then the only question was what history. I originally wanted to do French history because we were in Lausanne, and with Swiss history there wasn't a lot to it. And but knowing no Chinese history, at 17 I decided to do Chinese history because I got a list of the faculty members at a variety of distinguished European universities and went down the list to see if they had professors of their own history of other nationalities or ethnicities, and noticed that there weren't any, and thought that maybe at that time I thought if you wanted to do French history you would of course be a professor in France. And so I thought, well, then the career prospects might not be the most promising, and probably since no one from China was coming out, that would be a field that where there might be opportunities to go into, though I knew no Chinese history at the time.
Why did you go to Lausanne? I mean, your parents were in America.
My dad had to leave, and so he worked at CERN, at the Centre Européen de Recherche Nucléaire, for 2 years. And I enjoyed boarding school. I mean, there are people who enjoy boarding school and there are people who don't, and I actually enjoyed it tremendously.
You mentioned something about working. when you were about 16 or 17, emptying latrines and doing other sort of semi-manual work. That must have been in China.
That was in China. That was later. That was when I was 1920. And I was a junior in college at Yale. And opportunity came to, China had been closed and hadn't had foreign students for about 8 or 9 years. And the opportunity came to be one of the first new foreign students in China. There were 3 of us that were sent to China. We were all Chinese American, and we were all students at Yale. And one went to Peking University, one went to Nankai University now as well, and I went to Fudan. And so, but at that time the goal was to, what the Chinese call 体验生活, sort of to experience life, real life. And so I spent 2 months on campus approximately, about 6 weeks or so in the countryside, in one long stint and some shorter stints later, and about 6 weeks in a factory. And then also, because it was a cultural revolutionary period in Chinese universities, even when we were at the university, every Thursday we engaged the whole day in physical labor. So the latrine cleaning was when I was working at the countryside. Right.
So your further education was mainly at Yale or all at Yale? Or?
So I did my undergraduate education
in Chinese history?
Well, I did it in archaeology and history. And I did it at Yale, and then I did my graduate education at Chicago. And my brother, who's a professor of chemistry at Cornell, also had the exact same sort of career path with a boarding school, then Yale, then Chicago. And so I think there was some attraction to all of us to go to Chicago, since that was the school where my father got his degree. And what's distinctive about his degree is that it's his only degree, because he left Shanghai when he was 14, when the Japanese entered Shanghai, with his elder brother, my second uncle, but they rapidly became separated. So he was a refugee for several years, never graduated from high school, but because of China's entrance exams, was able to test into a good Chinese university. And then before he completed his undergraduate education, was sent to Chicago to be a graduate student.
When you decided to study Chinese history, how much Chinese language did you know?
I actually knew no Chinese. I remember when I applied to university, I applied to several schools, Harvard, Chicago, Yale, Columbia. And what happened was, I was very fortunate. The person who eventually became my thesis advisor, Professor Bingdi He, was asked by the University of Chicago to call me to recruit me to go to the University of Chicago. And I remember the first question he asked me was, do you know Chinese? And I said, no. And he said, well, don't come here. And he said, well, where else are you thinking of going? And I told him the names of the other schools. And he said, well, Columbia and Yale have the best Chinese departments, and there's not much point in trying to have a career in Chinese history if you haven't gotten the language down, so you should do that first. And since I really didn't want to stay at home, since my father was a professor at Columbia, so I went to Yale.
I see. And did you do your next degree at Yale as well?
No, I only did my first undergraduate degree, and I did my master's and PhD at Chicago.
I see.
Under Professor He.
Yes. Would you say he was someone who influenced you more than most? Or?
Oh, no, he's had I think a tremendous influence on sort of both on the selection of topics and on the sort of the need for kind of generalization as opposed to kind of more erudite, but less broadly focused sort of scholarship. And I think of all there's no other historian of China who can be said to have had any influence whatsoever on the development of Western history. And I think Professor He is the only one who can make that claim. His first book on his actual original work was in European history, but he got a degree. His PhD was from Columbia University, and it was on English economic history. But since, because of American immigration laws at the time, he couldn't find a job in the United States, and he worked in Canada, where he was put in the East Asia department. And so he switched to Chinese history, I gather, pretty much on his own. His first book was on studies of the population of China, 1368 to 1953. And that was a major work of institutional history. And he actually completed it in 1955. I think it wasn't published until 57 because he was waiting for the 53 Chinese census results to be published. But it just hit right at the time when there was a tremendous interest in sort of historical demography began in the West. His second book, which probably had the greatest kind of interchange with Western history, was published in 1962. And that was called, I think, Ladder of Success, the Chinese Civil Examination System, 1368 to 1911. And there he had, he tried to talk a lot about social mobility through examination systems. And there was actually a series of debating articles in comparative studies, a journal that comes out of the University of Michigan, which I think at the time may have been edited by Sylvia Thrupp, where he sort of debated his claims about social mobility in China with a variety of Western historians and sociologists. He later on went on to write a third and fourth book in Chinese, one on economic growth in China, Landsmannschaften, sort of associations of commercial organizations, and then a book on early paleo-agriculture and the Lus, and then he wrote a book called The Cradle of the East, published out of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, sort of on the origins of Chinese civilization. And he was just finishing that book when I showed up as a graduate student. And he arranged for me to, when I decided to go to graduate school there, he arranged for me, I remember, to take a research position with William McNeill and to take classes from Edward Shills and Professor Egan. And so I had sort of a kind of instant introduction to the Chicago sort of greats, and which all of which whom had a tremendous influence on sort of, I think, my kind of chaotic intellectual development.
One of those people particularly interests me, William McNeill. Can you say anything about him? What's the person and what you learned from him at all?
The thing about Mr. McNeill, I only worked for him for that 1 year, and he was finishing Plagues and Peoples, and I had a very minimal impact. I mainly just reading drafts and then giving him my thoughts, because the basic research was already done, the manuscript was already written. And but I talked to him regularly. He was on my thesis committee. He was my second reader. I guess there were three things that were. One was that he was remarkably sort of just straightforward and matter of fact. Everything was just sort of very businesslike, in the way he did work. The other one was, of course, this interesting kind of broad generalization and comparison. And then I think the third one would be that unlike Professor He, or some other Chicago professors, and this is probably because the first one, who seem to take sometimes their scholarship extremely personally and would get very emotionally involved. He always maintained a kind of Midwestern farm boy sort of exterior, where everything was, even when you were intellectually very committed to what you were writing, you were still you still had a kind of civility that Chicago doesn't always have in intellectual exchange, and that was very nice. Right.
Did you come across Marshall Salins at all? He was, must have been at Chicago then, I suppose.
When I was in Chicago physically, from 75 through 78, and then I went abroad to do my field work. And so that was like almost the high point of Chicago anthropology. And so Marshall Salins, Saul Tax, I mean, there were all these sort of right, Barney Cohen, Ron Inden. I took a class from Ron Inden on kingship. So they were all tremendously influential. I mean, they, on some level, since they, in terms of ruling as a group, the anthropologists and the economists were sort of the two kind of very opposite poles that you had in Chicago that tended to have the greatest influence. But they also operated at such a high level of sort of celebrity that there was a kind of facade where it wasn't as easy to actually, I felt, approach them to be a student and actually learn anything, like to do a long reading class or something. And so I never took any, Victor Mayer, right, so I never took any sort of other classes except for Inden's class and Egan's. Those are the only two anthropology classes I took. Right.
When you went on to do your PhD, what was the subject? Was that?
The subject changed. My first year at Chicago, I think almost the very moment I entered, Professor He asked me, do you want to write on the ancient past or the recent past? I knew very little about the recent past, and so I said the ancient past. And as he said, you write your thesis on the biography of Hammadi, who ruled from approximately 140 to about 87 BC. And so I did my major minor field in Roman history as a result to try to get some contrast. And but I found it simply impossible at that level of unsophistication to actually try to write a biography. And so after about 2 years, I went to see Professor He and I said that I really didn't think this was going to work. And so he said, okay, you write the frontier history of China. And so I originally started off to write the ancient frontier history of China, and then gradually, by the time I actually handed in the thesis, it became Southwest China, 1250 to 1850. As I sort of searched for data, and I was fortunate to have several years of funding where I could just go to libraries in Japan, Taiwan, and China and just sort of look at materials, and that provides a lot of the kind of broader empirical base of all my later work.
Did you do any field work for the thesis, or did you visit China?
When I was doing this work, I had two goals. One was to do the thesis research. The other was that Professor He insisted that I read and be fluent in source material from about 1000 BC to the present, because he required that any student that he graduated, he only graduated 3, should be able to actually sort of generalize about Chinese history at a broad level. And so I spent several months in Peking University doing bronze inscriptions, and then several months in Hong Kong reading with a very erudite Chinese historian the complete corpus from the 7th through the 9th century AD of written text. So I did those things, and then when I did my thesis research, I did do some, I did 2 abortive sets of fieldwork. One was in southern Sichuan, which was aborted because I developed bronchitis and a pulmonary infection and ended up in a hospital in Kunming. And one where I was looking at inscriptions of merchant associations from largely the 19th century in Jinping-xian in southern Yunnan. But then China and Vietnam had a war, and I was shipped back to Kunming again. So I had two abortive expeditions each time for about a week, and then ended up each time back in the library or an archive.
When then did you go to Yunnan? Because you spent some time.
First time I went to Yunnan was in 1979, and I was there from like March through maybe August. And then I went back several times in the 80s. But I haven't been back there since then.
What were you doing?
Most of the source material for Southwest China is in the provincial libraries, and so I was mainly reading in the libraries and the archives. And then later on, I was working on a book manuscript, which it will be coming out actually within the next few months from Harvard, and also simultaneously from Yunnan People's Press. But I had originally decided to publish an earlier draft. Well, it was necessary for my promotion at Caltech. But then once I got promoted, I withdrew the manuscripts from both presses, because I actually wasn't really happy with it, because I felt it was done under pressure and wasn't quite as mature as I would have liked it to have been.
So this was post-doctoral research?
Right.
Yeah. Right. So what began to take you towards Chinese population history, and the particular area you're working in now?
When I came back from Chicago in 1979, the department was in a state of sort of internecine kind of warfare, and I was fortunate enough to be offered a junior fellowship at the Michigan Society of Fellows. And so I actually decamped before finishing my thesis and just moved to Michigan. And I felt that as a junior fellow, your obligation wasn't so much to finish your degree as it was to use the time to try to sort of explore things you wouldn't do without this opportunity. And because of my professor's initial publication in population history, I think most students always have a desire to somehow compete with their professors one way or the other. I thought I would start to take some classes in demography, and also I knew already at that point that I would be going to the California Institute of Technology, because they had offered me a job before I received the fellowship, and so I had taken sort of postponed the acceptance, and I knew there would be no library, and so I started to do some formal classes in demographic analysis at Michigan. I continued to do some at Berkeley when I was at Caltech, and meanwhile went around looking for individual level data with which you could sort of begin actual work, and was fortunate enough to find some, and very slowly started this long sort of process, which has ended up where we are now.
What was the first data you found? Where was it from?
I began my work in the archives of the Forbidden City, I mean the Palace Archives, which the Chinese call the first historical archives in Peking. And I found a variety of different kinds of demographic data there, some aggregated, some individual level data, some stature data, but I remember that while I looked at it and did some preliminary work with the aggregates, I didn't find that kind of formal demography where you're sort of dealing with aggregated numbers very pleasurable, because you're very removed from the actual phenomenon you're studying. And I was very influenced by House Families and Households in Past Time, Peter Laszlo's book, and which had come out just at the time that I was beginning my sort of this whole intellectual sort of crusade. And so I felt, gee, you really needed to find material which had household structure, which had individuals, and where you could try to write something to do something sort of similar to what he and it seems so many other people in the 1970s were doing. Of course, it wasn't until the 1980s that I found data that allowed me to do that, but I wrote to every archive and library in China. And then a friend of mine told me that Liaoning had this sort of data because they had written a request to the archival ministry to destroy it because it was taking up too much space. And so, so I came up here the first time in 1982, then in 1985, 87, 89, repeatedly to sort of look at the archives, explore them, and
Since 89, when have you been? Which years?
well, starting in 89, I came less because what happened in 1989 was that by that time the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints had made the similar discovery and had purchased the entire demographic records of the Liaoning Provincial Archives on microfilm. And their restrictions on usage are much more flexible than the Liaoning Provincial Archives. So after that, I pursued most of the actual data we read was initially in the United States. Then what happened was we began to discover some very distinctive patterns of demographic behavior, but we weren't really clear because of the nature of the data whether these results were really robust. And so I stopped the project actually sort of at about 75% done, and decided I needed to find a better set of data that would allow us to ascertain whether the material we had, the behavior we had, was really correct or incorrect. By that time we had moved from doing sort of a kind of household demography to a more sort of straightforward demographic, behavioral kinds of questions about the level of fertility, the level of mortality, and so on. And so in the late 80s through the early mid-90s, I started a new project on the historical demography of the Imperial lineage, because I knew from my earlier work that although the Imperial lineage did not have household material, they had extremely detailed historical records where all vital events are recorded within 3 days of occurrence. And we did a very quick check and ascertained that the number of boys and girls were approximately the same, so that we could see whether our findings, for example, that we thought were suggestive about infanticide, we could actually find out whether they were mirrored in this better data set, although obviously for a very different population. And so late 80s, early 90s, we basically worked largely on that and wrote some articles which we published in Population Studies.
When you say we, is this Cameron?
Well, Cameron joined me in 1987 working on the Liaoning project. And we published some early articles together. But most, Wang Feng joined us when I started the Imperial lineage data. And he was a postdoc at the University of California at Berkeley, the graduate group in demography. And I'd heard that he had interest in historical demography, so I went to see him. And then, because 1989, June 4th happened, 1989, he was unexpectedly sort of uncommitted because he was actually on his way back to take a job at Peking University. And so I arranged for him to have what ended up being almost a full year of funding at Caltech. And so he worked with us during that time on this data, though most of the initial preliminary analysis was done by myself in Taiwan with my students and with Cameron, who did an enormous amount of the data processing, and then ultimately also checked all the results, which was very important because we made some boo-boos. And but it was a mix of myself, Wang Feng, Cameron, one or two other students from Caltech, and then some collaborators from Taiwan. One of whom, Lai Huiming, was at the meeting in Nankai. There was also someone named Liu Sufan from the Institute of Economics. And we were fortunate throughout that portion to have very generous funding from the Republic of China's Science Council, which allowed us to, and also from the Jiangjin Guo Foundation, which allowed us to pursue that project, and also to go to the archives in Peking to find the material that was not at the Utah. By that time, Utah had also copied all the data in the first historical archives. But to find supplementary materials, which was very important. And we subsequently also published an edited volume from Peking University Press in Chinese on the demographic behavior of the Imperial lineage.
You mentioned Peter Laslett. You've had quite a long association with the Cambridge group, the history of population and social structure, and in particular perhaps with Roger Schofield. Is that right? I mean, you knew Roger?
I met Roger the first time in 1984, 83. The population history of England was sort of newly out, and as you know, was just such a smash hit in sort of social science history circles in the United States. And Roger came and gave sort of what I assume was sort of the talk. And it was just so exciting that we immediately asked him to come in 1985 as a visiting professor. And he had the office next to mine. And so I observed him for that year. And then we actually offered him, just 2 days before he became ill, a permanent position at Caltech, which he orally had accepted and was supposed to meet with me, I remember Friday, at lunch to go over the schedule, because he wanted to withdraw gradually from the group so that there would be a good sort of a good transition. And I believe I showed up and was told that I think at 10:30 or 10 he was taken out on a stretcher in the process of writing that the introduction to the paperback edition. So, yeah.
So when you, once you've done the lineage, Imperial lineage work, I mean it goes on, but when did you sort of come back to the real work in detail?
1994, 1995. I went back to the Lineage work in detail, finished the manuscript in 1996 with Cameron. Cameron, 1994 to 1995, had a postdoc during which he was at the University of Michigan, but which they allowed him to work on the manuscript, and then we also invited him to Caltech for a quarter, and so we did some of the writing together, and but it was all sort of based on the first 2 chapters, which I wrote in the summer of 1994. Actually, I remember I wrote it in my brother's lab, and at the University of Michigan. He was at Michigan at the time.
And this turned into the book Fate and Fortune.
Right.
Probably a little difficult, but is it possible to sort of summarize the main findings of that book, or the main theme of the book, very briefly?
Well, the main idea of the book was to try to use the combination of our findings on household demography and demographic behavior tied to social organization to show that there was sort of that the 2 ostensibly opposite social myths of Chinese kind of social behavior. One is that Chinese society is very hierarchical and authoritarian, and the other is that Chinese society is very sort of individualistic, and to show that these 2 sides actually fit together, and that you could see this in rural society as well as, say, in elite behavior, so that you could see how, since in rural society, through these banners which you've been looking at with us for the last few weeks, how banner promotion was largely decided according to ability, not according to heredity, but household position was largely decided by heredity, and to show how both sort of ladders of success could work and would be reflected in a distinctive pattern of demographic behavior. One of where people who rose up either by heredity or by ability would have earlier marriage, would have a different preference for the sexual composition of their children, and different fertility patterns, and it turned out to also different mortality patterns, though not the ones we expected.
When you say not the ones you expected,
Well, we expected that people who were in higher in society should have higher survivorship, but we discovered that in fact that it was actually the opposite. That people who were higher in society tended to have lower mortality. I mean, tended to have higher mortality than the rest of society, and we wrote several tables about this in Fate and Fortune and called it the price of privilege, and noted various correlations, but we didn't have any very direct evidence as to what the causation was. But it's a pattern which we've documented, which others have documented again and again for Chinese society.
This in a sense was the first of a series of volumes which are coming out, and the second, I suppose, was One Quarter of Mankind, which came out in 1999, was it?
It came out in 1999.
Yes. Can you again sort of give a brief synthesis of the argument?
Well, I wrote One Quarter of Humanity with Wang Feng in 1997, largely in the summer of 1997. Then rewrote it in 1998. Cameron was was not working on another project at the time, but then he later on, once we finished the manuscript, actually Wang Feng for a variety of reasons had to drop out, and Cameron was very helpful in on the last chapter and going over the manuscript with me. The basic idea was to take the rather sort of specialist demographic findings which we had presented in sort of demography articles and population studies in our Chinese book that were sort of sandwiched into Fate and Fortune, which when I relook at it is probably was too dense, and to make it more approachable for a broader audience, and to also try to see what we could draw out in the way of generalizations once we set our own findings within the context of everybody else's work on Chinese historical demography, plus the very robust and numerous findings for other societies, especially for Western Europe. We emphasize sort of four distinctive patterns of Chinese demographic behavior. One is the lopsided mortality pattern by sex, the female infanticide, which I mentioned earlier. The second is the consequent lopsided marriage market, where all women get married largely, but a significant proportion of men never get married, and all women get married early, and some men get married, if they do get married at all, they get married much later. The third was a surprisingly low level of marital fertility, where total fertility maybe in China may be roughly comparable to total fertility in other historical societies, but because of universal marriage, marital fertility had to be lower, or otherwise you would have had you would have had an enormous population cataclysm much earlier. And then finally, building on the work of Arthur Wolff, who had talked about little daughter-in-law adoption and son-in-law adoption, we sort of worked on son adoption as well to show how there's a variety of, perhaps because of the low marital fertility, that people had a variety of other strategies where they could maintain their descent group.
You mentioned Arthur Wolff there, and I think he's obviously someone who's worked in similar fields to you, but I gather that in relation to that book particularly, there was some disagreement about some of your findings. What did Arthur find was
right,
and how do you
well,
answer?
Arthur wrote a book which I still think is one of the great books of demographic anthropology or historical anthropology, which is called Marriage and Adoption in China. Although he wrote that with someone named Huang Jiesan, although it's really talking about a few villages in Taiwan in the early 20th century. But he, in that book and in a subsequent book on sexual attraction and incest, his very detailed study on the Westermark hypothesis, he uses fertility rates, contrasting fertility rates, to try to show that certain forms of marriage which are closer to incest are lower fertility, and then he ascribes that to a kind of social, biological, instinctive reaction. So I think he found our original statement first in the population studies article, which he probably largely ignored, but then later on in 1/4 of Humanity, that there was a culture of control for fertility behavior with marriage. He found that to be sort of a direct attack on one of the basic sort of types of proof that he was using in his book. And I think that was probably what set him off on his sort of rampage against us in Population Development Review, where he tries to argue that marital fertility actually could not possibly have been as low as we claimed.
Then the work continues, and you've got another book coming out, Life Under Pressure. Well, this is a collection of 3 authors, 4 authors.
Oh no, this one has 17 authors, but 3 lead ones.
I read the work of the 3 leading ones anyway. What do you mean by life under pressure, and what's the theme?
Well, the title comes actually from an article written by David Weir. But in 1994, Akira Hayami, who was I think a mutual friend, yes, had the idea of trying to do a comparative project between demographic behavior in Japan, China, and Europe. And he initially approached Tommy Bengtsson, a historical demographer at Lund University in Sweden. And Tommy took this idea and thought, well, why not make it a kind of more systematic comparison a la Household and Family and Past Time, but with a much more sort of disciplinary rigor in terms of the kinds of calculations that would be done. And so in the summer of 1994 and the winter of 1994, we had 2 preparatory meetings first at Osaka and then at Lund. Cameron joined me for Cameron joined me for the first meeting, and during which they invited a variety of other people who they thought had similar data, and by the time we met in Lund, we'd increased initially it was Japan, China, Sweden, and Belgium. By the time we met in Lund, we'd added Italy. And we subsequently tried on and off to collaborate with a variety of Dutch authors. And probably we'll do more comparison with them in the future. So the idea is to take populations, rural populations, where you have complete individual level data for the community that includes information not just on household structure, social organization, demographic behavior, but also on social economic status and characteristics. That the data should be continuous, more or less, or very periodic. That you should be able to have either real wage or grain price data for these populations as well. And that what we would do is we would actually test the famous Malthusian sort of model of as economic pressure rises, exactly how do populations behave in terms of their mortality response, modulated through the social organization of the community and the family. And we decided on this largely at the Lund meeting in late 1994, and then we met then a small group of us, I wasn't present, it was largely Cameron and Tommy who were mainly responsible, produced the initial multivariate model. Then we met starting in either 1995 or early 1996. We started meeting periodically. We met, I think I calculated that we've met something like 18 to 20 times in the last 8 years as a large group, sort of constantly going over the model and refining it, and then just changing the outcome behavior, sometimes from mortality to fertility to marriage behavior, migration. But each time going over the calculations in great detail. And it was necessary to have such a large group in order to do this kind of comparison at this level of detail. But when it came to the actual sort of writing and synthesis of the work, it was simpler to have a small group. And so it ended up being largely Tommy, Cameron, and myself who sort of pulled the results together. Although there are a lot of comparative chapters with different authors, and every chapter is multi-authored, sort of reflecting the true collaborative nature of the project. I think the book makes a variety of very interesting and unusual and unexpected discoveries. But overall, for the project, I think the main discovery has been that we had originally thought, perhaps all our earlier work and Malthus, that we would be contrasting a series of rural societies which had more of a culture of control, which we thought would be more characteristic of our Chinese and perhaps some of our Japanese populations, with populations from Scania, from eastern Belgium, from northern Italy, where we thought there would be a more natural mortality pattern, a more classic European fertility pattern, and a marital pattern which would be more identified with individual choice and romantic love. And what we discovered was that, first and foremost, I think, was that the degree of proactivism in every community, in almost every kind of behavior, was simply far greater than we had thought was possible. But that the communities, how they would allocate, they would be at the family level, at the village level, or at the state level. Various decisions would be made about allocation of resources, about behavioral preferences, and that these would result in very distinctive demographic profiles, so that you could see preference and choice and activism made in every society, not just sort of this east-west contrast. And that really forced us to rethink a lot about social behavior and social theory, in the sense that in a lot of sort of simplistic social theory, you tend to look at a sort of an exogenous variable like climate or nutrition, something which somehow changes behavior, and where on some level human society is relatively passive. And what we discovered was that with this kind of activism, which we can actually document best in reproductive behavior, you actually, that the results sort of confound a lot of the kind of predictions of these sort of ideal type models that especially perhaps sociologists, Chicago sociologists, love so much.
You mentioned Malthus once or twice. I note at the end of one of your books, you rather sadly say that after all this work, it looks as if, on the whole, with some notable exceptions, the 19th century political economists roughly got China right.
Well, they certainly got the contrast right. I mean, I think what was really, one of the things which was really on some level gratifying, I don't think it was we were that disappointed, was the degree to which sort of recent theory is confounded. Earlier theory is, if anything, at least the basic intuitions is confirmed. And I think the reason for that is that recent theory there tends to delight too much in the deductive powers of social theorists. So they start with a principle and then they go on from there and they develop sort of theories of behavior. So, for example, Kingsley Davis's famous idea that big households should have bigger, stronger safety nets, and therefore should have greater marriage rates and lower mortality rates than smaller household societies. Whereas 19th century theory, I think what you had people who really tried to just read very widely an actual sort of empirical work and tried on some level to combine more induction with logic, and where there was perhaps more respect for empirical work. And the reality is, of course, is that many of the people that they were reading, say James Barrows on China, were very perceptive observers of what was going on. And so I think because they were anchored in reality, that their basic idea, for example, that there should be some real sort of difference in sort of the ideal models of behavior in the East and the West, that's the text you're specifically referring to, I think was absolutely correct. And it may not be exactly the way they thought, but then who would expect someone 200 years ago to get it right down to the T? And that's very refreshing, because it means that in the United States, where perhaps social science tends to be more trendy sometimes, there's a tendency sometimes to poo-poo the great thinkers. You can easily become a professional demographer and never read Malthus in the United States. So this allows us to sort of maintain intellectual continuity, and also allows us to raise the level of debate and discussion, which I think is very nice. And also means that we can go back to having more discussion with scholars like you and from Europe, where you haven't deviated as much perhaps as we have in the United States.
When you mention the difference in the ideal models and so on, as you know, we've discussed the Great Divergence thesis of Pomerantz and others. Could you just sort of summarize that argument and say what you think about it briefly?
Well, Ken Pomerantz wrote a book called The Great Divergence, which was published in the year 2000, which had an enormous impact, especially beginning in economic history, and then later on to sort of the larger historical community, where using a reanalysis and a recombination of a very broad reading of economic history of China, to a lesser extent Japan, economic history of Europe, he tried to show that the standards of living, as measured by life expectancy, by the consumption of certain goods such as sugar or clothing or the amount of furniture, that the levels were, say, in the late 18th century, which some people had thought would already have diverged considerably. Certainly, even late Enlightenment thinkers were under the impression that by that time there already was this tremendous divergence in living standards. He shows that the divergence really wasn't as great as was previously thought. And then he tries to show that this is because that what he calls Smithian, again a nice sort of deference to sort of classic economic thought, Smithian patterns of economic growth were common not just to sort of pre-industrial Europe, but were, if anything, even more common and more triumphant in China. And so then he posits that what you have is, however, starting in the late 18th and 19th century, is the beginning of a very different kind of sort of economic world behavior. One which is dominated by comparative advantage, transatlantic trade, comparative advantage of other things as well, and that explains the divergence more than earlier differences in behavior. the book is, what's very nice about the book is that it's very bold. It has some empirical results you can actually test, but it also uses a kind of deductive pattern of logic from first principles, which you can actually follow through. So it's not just sort of the summation of a lot of qualitative data and then the assertion of a thesis. But it's also I think it must be the first volume in what would be a series. Though I've never talked to Ken, I know that's true, of books which would develop this in more detail.
And what's your feeling about it?
In One Quarter of Humanity, and I think in also to some extent in The Great Divergence, and in a book by a colleague of both of ours, by China Transformed by Bin Wang, they were all trying to show that whether you're talking about state formation or economic processes or demographic processes, that there are fundamentally sort of different models, ideal models of behavior, which have different paradigms, and that while they may lead to outcomes which are roughly the same, that they're fundamentally sort of really different. And it's very, we do this perhaps the most explicitly in One Quarter of Humanity, because demography, by the nature of the field, is easier to make these kinds of explicit comparisons and to sort of discuss the underlying behavior that produces these outcomes. But I think Bin talking about state formation, and Ken as well, Ken talking about economic processes, also tries to make this point. The problem that they have is that unlike is that while we all share the same insight, they don't have as deep an empirical foundation to sort of document the alternative model. We've been very fortunate because with a combination of Cameron Campbell, who's a sociologist at UCLA, of Wang Feng, who's a sociologist at UC Irvine, with many other students who worked with us, with the scholars in Taiwan who worked with us in Imperial genealogy, some here in China who worked with us on Liaoning, and on the genealogy of the Imperial lineage, with the massive number of people who've worked in Life Under Pressure, that we have accumulated in the last, especially 10 years, but going back 20 years, sort of a very large kind of empirical basis, sort of a lot of facts with which to sort of sort out an alternative model. And that because they tend to follow a more classic, solitary intellectual mode of production, so they don't have the benefit of having a dozen people instead of one historian sort of gathering all these facts. And so I think, but I'm optimistic that it seems that at least in the United States, where for a while empirical work and facts were out of fashion, there seems to be a gradual swing of the pendulum back. And I'm optimistic that given the voluminous data in China that's available for study, that their students and their colleagues will be able to sort of revise and document these initial insights that they've had in their books.
I wondered if we could turn a little bit to the contemporary situation as you see it in China. We came here some few years ago and obviously have been enormously struck by the vast contrast. What do you think have been the really major changes in the period in which you worked in China?
Well, what makes Chinese history, I guess, or just study of China so exciting is both the scale of the society, and then, especially in the last 50 years, there's been this incredible sort of pace of change in whatever direction China is moving. And for the last 20 years, of course, you have this the opening up to the outside world, and you have the tremendous increase in living standards, and the tremendous sort of growth in China's sort of economic productivity, to some extent in science, its attempts to sort of re-engage the world as a responsible sort of country, or not. And I think that if you had to point to one specific sort of change, it would of course be the sort of the rise in living standards and the tremendous elevation of a society which contrasts with the West, really did seem impoverished. Now, I mean, I believe the World Bank standard statistics say that since 1980, China's lifted approximately 120 million or more people out of poverty, and that there were about 80 million left, but that's already a great achievement. And I remember in 1979, I visited a village in Guizhou, and you always have the standard question in 1979, which is, what are the great achievements that your society has achieved since liberation? And the village chief, who must be quite caustic, said we have had two great achievements. The first is the thermos bottle. Every family has a thermos bottle. And the second is the bed. No one sleeps on the ground. And he said, we're working on shoes. And I mean, now China is no longer working on this sort of basic level of material comfort. So that's very impressive.
And the communications revolution, I suppose, is impressive. It's great at television and now the internet. And
that's so recent. It's almost hard to keep up with. But indeed, I mean, the spread of phones and of broadband communication, it's so new that I don't think anyone's actually studied it for China, except maybe, right, and then maybe some sales specialist for Ericsson or Nokia.
You sound very optimistic, or pretty optimistic about China's near future anyway, depending on the world situation. Do you feel it's going to continue to keep up this amazing pace for another 10, 20 years?
Well, I think what Chinese history shows is the amazing ability of political demagogues to derail and change patterns of behavior from anything you would predict. But at the same time, in the absence of that kind of leadership, both in China and outside of China, I think that you'd have to be optimistic if you come to the society regularly and see the rate of change that this will continue, and that we're really viewing a massive revolution in sort of the living standards and the behavior and the thoughts of a really significant portion of the world's population.
My last question is if you were advising a young or elderly scholar who was trying to understand China and get a few keys to approaching it in such a vast place and so complex and with such a long history, are there any bits of advice you would give? I mean, in English history, if I'm asked that question, I would say look at the law. I mean, the legal system, I think, is the backbone. Through that, you can understand a great deal of English culture. If you were asked a similar question about China, what advice would you give?
I don't think I would select a specific field as a place to start, but I would say that I wouldn't begin with a specific hypothesis. I would begin with a topic, and I would try to devote and allow myself time to really sort through the empirical riches that China has to offer in the way of information related to the topic. And that so long as, I mean, this I sound very much like a positivist, but I think it's really true. If the student was to do that, which is not the prevalent mode of research in a lot of American universities, I'm confident that they would develop they would make some sort of important advances in our knowledge about China. I think right. Yeah.
Because the great comparativist de Tocqueville compared, when he said he was trying to understand America, he felt that there were it was like a forest which had certain straight paths, and if you understood where these straight paths ran, you could plot much of American society if you knew the principles of equality and democracy and so on. You could then read quite quickly what you saw around you, the chaos around you. Whereas in England, he said, because it was a long and continuous and complicated, convoluted history, it was impossible to do this. You needed to spend much longer, and you had to travel down all the paths. They wound round, and you had to follow them the whole way through until they came back to where you started from. And that was a huge difference in trying to understand these civilizations. I know that Japan is like England in that sense. You can't just read it off on the basis of certain principles. But it seemed on the surface of it, the little I know about China, that China is in some ways less complicated than what I know of Japan. Do you think that's just an illusion?
Really, I think I really don't know, because the level of empirical research just isn't deep enough for us to distinguish a lot of regional patterns or local patterns of behavior from a kind of national pattern. The problem with China is scale. It's, by all accounts, in 1750, China is 40% of the world's population, or close to that. And it's a continental society in terms of the dimensions of geography as well. And so I think that it's too early for us to tell. What China does share with Japan is the tremendous difference between facade and actual behavior. There is, because of the bureaucracy, because of the long tradition of the continuity of texts, there is a tremendous amount of emphasis on prescriptive behavior. And to what extent that's true or not, though, probably varies tremendously from place to place. So I would say that we just really don't know. But what's really exciting about Chinese history is that we're at this level where the world is sort of, you're entering this really enormous department store, full of possibilities. And especially if you were to work in the last 300 years, where the empirical database is just so much richer. It's just so chock-a-block with really fun things to look at. And so the students should sort of allow themselves ample time to go through the store and pick and choose and enjoy what they're doing.
That's a good consumer metaphor.
Well, I mean, we obviously should ask at that particular point, how difficult is it for a non-Chinese to work in China?
I think it's quite difficult. I think it's especially because you have to understand, it's not just our study of China that's just beginning. For Chinese, their own study of their own society is also just beginning. So you're dealing with a system in a society where reality, even academic reality, was so much, for the last 50 years, was created by command. And so for every scholar, Chinese scholars as well as Western scholars, therefore pioneering this field, despite the enormous amount of material that's available, is quite difficult. But it's compounded for Western scholars by the problem of language. So because very few people in China speak any other language than Chinese, because this kind of scholarship is just beginning, and so therefore there's such a likelihood that a foreign scholar will be the first at whatever it is they're studying. You have sort of the double whammy of first in the field, as well as first sort of outside scholar, and so that makes it hard. But at the same time, I think it's still a possibility. And with the enormous number of Chinese students, especially going abroad, it's an increasing possibility because professors can collaborate with students on projects and who are Chinese, and we're coming back and doing research. And so I expect we'll be seeing a lot of those kinds of collaborations in particular going on in the future.